Hello, so I want to talk a bit about six-string basses. I get a lot of questions about playing the six-string bass, so I thought I'd put together a video where I talk about why I play a six-string bass, but also giving you some advice of things to look out for if you're thinking of taking up six-string bass or if you're already learning it. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about the history of the bass guitar and how and why the six-string bass came to exist. I should probably start by saying that how many strings you play on your bass is not actually the most important thing. What's important is the music, not numbers of strings. But having said that, I have good reasons for playing six-string bass, so I thought I'd share with you some of what they are. Now, first and foremost, the main advantage of playing a six-string bass is just the extra range that you get. So if your standard four-string bass is the four strings in the middle, you have an extra low string and an extra high string. So you have extra range in both low and high directions. So that extra low string is extremely helpful. And the high string is really for if you want to explore kind of melody, harmony, chord voicings, those kind of things on your bass guitar. For me, I'm always looking to explore music and the full range of the instrument, which is why I love to play six-string basses. Now, I know that some bass players are not interested in doing that kind of melodic and harmonic playing, and if that's not for you, then probably the six-string bass is not going to be your instrument. But if you're interested in exploring that kind of thing, it might be worth looking into exploring a six-string bass. Is it harder to learn to play a six-string bass? Well, yes and no is the honest answer to that. If you've never played a six-string bass before and you're used to playing four and five-string basses, it will seem a bit harder when you first start playing. But having said that, for me, when I play four and five-string basses, I approach them in exactly the same way that I approach the six-string bass, both technically and musically. There's really no difference, and it isn't any harder for me to play the six-string bass. But you do need to have a really solid technique if you're going to play the six-string bass well. There are a few technical things that I sometimes see bass players doing which are not going to translate well onto a six-string bass. So for example, I sometimes see people playing with their thumb on the left hand on top of the neck like this. You can kind of get away with that a little bit on four-string bass, even though it's not great technique. But on the six-string bass, with the extra width on the neck, you're not going to be able to get good access to playing on the low strings. And so you're not going to be able to explore the full range of the instrument. So you have to have a really good solid left hand technique. Another thing to think about is string dampening, which is something that all bass players need to think about. You want to make sure there's no unwanted noise coming from the strings that you're not playing. Now that's a consideration for 4, 5 and 6 string players, but obviously the more strings you have, the more strings there are to dampen. So it's a bit more of a technical consideration on a 6-string bass than it is on a 4-string bass. Now I have heard it said by some people that you should learn to play a 4-string bass really, really well before you try and learn a 6-string bass. Now I have to say I don't agree with that at all. You need to learn with the instrument that you play. If you take that argument to its logical conclusion, then you should start with just one string on your bass, really learn that properly before you even try moving to a 2nd string and then a 3rd string. That's not how you learn to play a musical instrument. You learn by really learning the instrument you have. So if you want to play a 6-string bass, then my recommendation would be to get a 6-string bass and really learn that instrument. Learn all 6 strings. Don't just learn and play 4 strings. And while we're on the subject, it is a little bit more difficult to learn to play slap bass on a 6-string bass, just because the C string, the 1st string, gets in the way a little bit when you're slapping and pulling. So you have to have, again, you have to adapt your technique. You have to make sure you have a strong technique if you want to play in this style. So what should you look out for if you're thinking of buying a 6-string bass? Now the first thing that I would recommend looking out for is a nice wide string spacing. You want to get your string spacing to be pretty much the same as it would be on a 4-string bass. There are some 6-string basses out there with very, very narrow necks and the strings are very, very close together. Now if you have a bass like that, if you play a bass like that, it's going to feel like you're playing a completely different instrument to playing a 4-string bass. Now I've already said that my approach to playing the 4 and 5-string bass is the same as it is to playing the 6-string bass. I want it to feel like it's the same instrument. If there's a very, very different string spacing, then it's going to feel like a completely different instrument. Now another technical consideration is the sound. You want to make sure it's got a very clear sound all the way across the range. You want a bass that's got a nice strong low B string. Okay, so you want to make sure those notes on the low B string really pop out, and you also get the clarity in in the high strings there. So you want to make sure that the bass sounds really good all the way across its range. So if you've got a bass, a 6-string bass that sounds weak in the low area, or you can't play it up here, then you're losing some of the benefit of having the extra range that the 6-string gives you. So you want to make sure it's very playable all the way across its range, nice clear sound all the way from bottom to top. Now, one other thing to think about is the balance of the instrument. Now, if I take my hands off the instrument, you see that the bass just balances on my lap without me needing to hold it. Now, that's really, really important. A lot of 6-string basses will have very heavy necks, and what will happen is when I take my hands off like that, the neck will immediately dive for the floor like this. You don't want that, okay? That's really something to look out for, because if your bass is like that, that means you have to hold on to it constantly with your left hand while you're playing, which is really going to kill your technique. You remember I said that you need a very strong left hand technique if you're going to play 6-string bass well? Well, if your bass doesn't balance well, it's going to ruin your left hand technique. So you want to check that your bass is well balanced, has a really clear sound all the way across its range, and has a nice wide string spacing just like a 4-string bass, and then you've got a good quality instrument. So I just want to leave you with one more thought, which is about the history of the bass guitar. Now, a lot of people assume that the bass was invented by Leo Fender in the 1950s, but it was actually invented about 20 years earlier than that. And the early electric basses were not called bass guitars, they were called bass fiddles, because they were based on the orchestral string family. They were based on things like violins and double basses, which is why they have 4 strings and why they're tuned like a double bass. Now, what Leo Fender did, which completely revolutionized the instrument, was that he realized they'd be a lot easier to play if they had guitar bodies, not fiddle bodies. So he invented the modern bass guitar as we know it now by taking the original bass fiddle, the original electric basses, and adding a guitar body to it. But he didn't change the tuning. He kept the same tuning with the 4 strings. Now, if you go 20 years further forward than that, into the mid-70s, there was a bass player called Anthony Jackson, who hopefully you know because he's a great bass player. And he was thinking, well, if this is a bass guitar, not a bass fiddle, why do we still retain the tuning of the double bass? Surely if it's the lowest instrument in the guitar family, then it should have 6 strings like a guitar. And he came up with the standard tuning for a 6-string bass that we now have. And it took a few years to catch on, but now obviously there's a lot of 6-string basses out there. A lot of people like to play them, and you can even get good quality instruments for a fairly reasonable price. Now, if you're interested in learning more about this, or you're thinking of picking up the 6-string bass, then please check out my website. I've put a lot more information on there. Check out what I've written on johnnycoxmusic.com.